Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Diffusion, the educational course on MR Diffusion Imaging. My name is Flavio Dell'Acqua, and I'm very happy to see that although it's 8 a.m., people are already here and keep coming, so good. And the aim of this course is actually to give you an overview of what is really behind the diffusion imaging study. So today, all the speakers are going to present different techniques, but the idea is not to show just a nice picture or what are the best results we can do, we can obtain with diffusion imaging. The idea is to show you what is behind, how we can get there, and more importantly, why sometimes we need to do some change, some choice. For example, why we need to choose some models or some kind of tractography algorithm. And my wish is that this course will be very interactive, so I try to put some time between each talk for some question, but then again, before any coffee break, we can also have 5 minutes more to ask questions again for the previous talks if you want. So I want that this course is very relaxed, so hopefully you enjoy. And just to give you a first overview of what we are going to talk today is the course is organized like a real diffusion pipeline. So we are going to start first from diffusion, diffusion acquisition, MR diffusion acquisition. Then we'll move to preprocessing, diffusion modeling, and tractography. That will be the morning. After that, in the afternoon, we'll move to more a diffusion analysis. So how can we do group comparison? How can we do track analysis and a little bit of connectomics? And then we'll close with the last two talks talking about preclinical imaging and diffusion and postmortem imaging, and also what is the biophysical meaning of diffusion imaging and diffusion contrast. So there will be a lot of validation and correlation with histology. So I think I already talked too much, and let me introduce the first speaker. And as I said, let's start from acquisition. Is Professor Carla Miller from Oxford University, and she's going to talk about MR diffusion acquisition. Thank you.
Okay, great. So first, thanks to Flavio for organizing this course. If there's anything like the course last year, I think you'll find the talks are really excellent and really informative. I'm actually going to begin with a bit of an apology. So I unfortunately have to attend a teleconference back in England this morning. So I'm going to have to run at 10 o'clock. Well, I run about 9:30 actually, but I'll try and leave time for questions at the end. And if you have any questions that we don't have time to get to, please do feel free to email me. You can see my email address there. I'm very happy to take any questions. So, okay, let's see. I guess I'm supposed to use this thing, is that right? Is this what I'm supposed to use? It's on a Mac, I think. Awesome. Yeah, okay, you got to hold it up. All right, okay, hold it up.
Sorry.
That's all right. Okay, here we go. Let's go back. This is awesome. Is it possible for you to take it back? Oh, wait, there we go. Okay, excellent. So let's begin with what is diffusion? Just very briefly, I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. So diffusion, in the sort of broadest sense, is the random motion of particles due to thermal energy. And here we're, of course, talking about water molecules because we're talking about MRI, where we're looking at water in the brain. And so as water molecules collide, they cause displacement. And so the example everybody likes to give about this is you have water molecules in a beaker of water, and they're colliding with each other constantly. And you put an ink droplet into that beaker of water. Everyone's done this. You see these sort of beautiful chaotic patterns of that ink dispersing through the water. And initially, it creates these sort of streamy patterns that you see here. And then ultimately, if you wait long enough, the ink molecules will be sort of equally distributed. And the thing that is driving that is this process of diffusion, of water molecules colliding with ink molecules. And what that looks like, if you look at a number of water molecules that all begin in the same location, and you just track where they are over time, you would see something like this, where I have a small number of particles here, and they're moving because they're colliding with each other, and maybe with some water molecules that you can't see here. And so this process then is described it turns out, it's a Gaussian over time. So if you look over time, you see that the displacement is described by a Gaussian distribution or a normal distribution with standard deviation given here. And so there's two components to this. One is time, because of course over time these water molecules are moving out. And then the second is this diffusion coefficient D. And so the game that we're going to play in diffusion imaging is we're going to try to estimate this diffusion coefficient D. Normally, diffusion is isotropic. That means it's equal in all directions. You can see here in the x and y plane in the two directions in this animation, there's no real preference to move along one direction or another. So why would this be interesting then? It's interesting because as soon as you move outside of that simple system of water molecules in a beaker of water, and you move to a slightly more interesting system like tissue, all of a sudden, it's no longer quite such a simple process. So these diffusing molecules, we often think of them as following a random walk, and I'm sure you'll hear about people sort of simulating diffusion in this way later on. If we look at unrestricted diffusion, water molecules will sort of take this sort of random pathway. And as soon as they're in tissue, where you have restricting boundaries, so you have membranes that are causing the water molecules not to be able to disperse as far as they would otherwise, suddenly what you've created is sort of a marker for tissue microstructure. How much is the tissue restricting diffusion with, for example, water molecules that are trapped inside a cell or some other compartment, or water molecules that are hindered by in the extracellular space by the presence of these cells. And in particular, we're today going to be very interested in this property, which is diffusion anisotropy in white matter. So what I mean by that is when you have a highly organized and highly oriented structure, like we have in white matter, where we have white matter tracks, they contain a lot of axons, they tend to be very densely packed, and they're all very directionally oriented. And what happens in this system is that you have free diffusion along the axons, or relatively free diffusion, but across the axons, the water molecules become restricted. So what does that look like? It looks something like this. So now instead of having our water molecules able to move equally in all directions, they're fairly strongly restricted to the orientation that these axons, so the cylinders here representing axons. And what that results in then is what we would call anisotropic diffusion. So there's a preferred orientation of diffusion. And that orientation, that directionality, tells us about the orientation of those tracts. It also tells us something about what people often refer to as fiber integrity. Now, this is a term that you're going to be hearing about, these sort of concepts throughout the day. That there are terms that we use like fiber integrity that are a bit woolly, and I'm sure we'll hear lots more about this. But basically with the concept that if you have dense fiber tracts that are sort of where the tissue is intact, then you would expect to see a fairly strongly anisotropic diffusion process. And there's all sorts of caveats that we can put on this, and in diffusion, in general, you should sort of have a healthy skepticism about anything. Anytime anyone tells you that something is very clearly interpretable, but we'll come to that later in the course. Okay. Okay, there we go. So the main topics then that I want to cover today are first, how is diffusion weighting achieved? So how can we get a signal where we can actually detect these effects that I was just showing you? Then how do we acquire an image? So how can we actually create an image that has that diffusion weighting? And then finally, some of the things that you have to worry about in actually designing an experiment. Okay, so the first thing then that I want to do is to remind you of some of the really basic tenets of MR and how they relate then, how they translate into a signal that we can detect. So I'm not assuming that you're all very familiar with physics. So let me begin with precession. So in creating signal in MR, we excite the signal. We push it out of alignment with the main magnetic field, which is shown here along the vertical direction, or the Z direction. And when we do that, the magnetization will precess about that field. So it undergoes this kind of funny rotational motion. And usually what we think about is the frequency, so omega, of that rotation, how quickly it's rotating around, is proportional to the magnetic field. And so normally we think about this in terms of the main magnetic field, B0. So that's your 1.5 or 3 or 7 Tesla magnet. And that is the primary determinant of what the rate of this precession is. But actually, there's an additional term that we kind of include as a catch-all. And there's lots of things that can modulate this field, so they can add to it, increasing or decreasing it. Oops. That's really quite annoying, isn't it? Okay. Nope. It's just advancing in the wrong direction. Okay. So one more. There we go. All right. All right. So the point being here that anything that offsets this magnetic field is going to modulate this rate of precession. And that is the fundamental concept that underlies how we're going to achieve diffusion weighting. Okay, so that's the first concept, precession, and the fact that we can modulate it. The second concept is dephasing. So if we have a range of frequencies within a voxel, then all of the magnetization that has different frequencies is going to exhibit this property that we call dephasing, which is that after we excite it, all of every component of magnetization within your voxel, which is sitting at some well-defined frequency, is going to precess at a rate that is proportional to that frequency. And so if we have a range of frequencies within the voxel, what happens is after we excite, then within that voxel, if we look at all of the different magnetization components, they're going to spread out relative to each other over time. And this is a process because the angle within the plane we call phase, then we use the term dephasing to describe this effect. And importantly, that then leads to very rapid signal loss. So the reason for this, if you think about what's happening, within a voxel, the signal that we get is a summation of all of the signal from all of these different magnetization components. And if one of them is pointing in this direction, another is pointing in the opposite direction, then those two signals are actually going to cancel. And so when we have the magnetization fanned out like this, then we actually lose signal. And this is an important effect in all sorts of aspects of MRI. This is at the heart of fMRI. It's the reason why we have what I'll call, to introduce you to in a second here, which is spin echoes. And so this is actually, again, going to be critical to how we actually how we achieve diffusion contrast. So let me then introduce a third concept, very briefly. Pretty quickly we'll start to put all these things together, and you'll see why I'm going through all these concepts. And that is a refocusing pulse. Most people are familiar with the idea that we use radio frequency pulses to excite the magnetization, to push it out of alignment with the main magnetic field. But in fact, we can use those pulses also to manipulate the magnetization wherever it is in our three-dimensional space. So for example, if we have magnetization in the transverse plane, we can also use RF pulses to sort of move it around. And this is a trick that we play all the time in physics, is we use these pulses to kind of manipulate the magnetization, move it around, put it where we want it to be. And so a key concept that we have then, and this is going to relate back to dephasing, is a refocusing pulse. So what we have is our excitation pulse, which is going to be on immediately here. And then what you're going to see is a pulse that's going to tip the magnetization by 180 degrees. So we excite it, it's moving around, and then we flip it by 180 degrees. Okay? So why is that a useful thing to do? It's a useful thing to do because it directly addresses this issue of dephasing and associated signal loss. So let's do the same thing now, but now we have all of our spins, and they're going to phase out, dephase. So as they dephase, that 180-degree pulse manages to flip them in just such a way that they all come back into alignment. And to think about why that is, I'm going to risk going back and playing that again, which is probably a terrible idea. Okay. In time it may come. All right. I'm playing with fire now. Okay. So the basic idea is we excited the magnetization. It was all lined with the x-axis, and then it spread out. And that spreading out was basically accumulating some y component, right? What that 180-degree pulse did is it flipped the y component. And if you think about what that does, is it creates a situation where, however far the magnetization rotated in the first half of the experiment, when you negate the y component and it then continues to precess, by definition, however far it got in the first half of the experiment, the second half of the experiment, it's going to undo exactly that amount of motion. Okay? So what this creates then is what we call a spin echo. Why do we call it a spin echo? If you look at the signal on the right, that might give you some kind of a feeling for it. So the dashed line represents the signal, how quickly we would be losing signal loss if we didn't have any dephasing, if we just had, for example, signal loss due to T2. And the solid line represents the signal from this spin echo. And so what you see is that we very quickly lose signal in the first half as it's all fanning out. And then After the flip, where the magnetization starts to come back into alignment, now we have the signal returning, and we have this peak. And people call that an echo. If you think about what's happening, it actually is very much like an acoustic echo that you might think of. You sort of hear the signal sort of slowly fading out, and then it comes back with this ghostly sort of response of the same thing that you heard initially. So we call that an echo or a spin echo. So spin echoes are important in diffusion because they are the basis of how we acquire almost all of our diffusion experiments, and that almost is important. You will inevitably hear about other methods that people are developing, but sort of 99% of what we do in diffusion is using this spin echo pulse sequence. So it's characterized by this excitation followed by 180 degree, and then finally an acquisition. And what we're going to do to turn this into a diffusion sequence is put these two gradients in. So trapezoids here represent gradients. Now gradients, if you're familiar with gradients, you're probably used to thinking of them as the part of the scanner that enables you to form an image. We use it to define K-space. But here we're going to use it for something different. We're going to use it for position encoding and decoding, kind of similarly to how we use it in imaging, but we're not actually going to use it to, in any sense, define our voxel. What we're going to use it for is position encoding and decoding specifically to look for this process of diffusion. So we refer to these as diffusion gradients. So let's look at how that works. So what I'm showing you here, same pulse sequence on the top, and at the bottom I'm going to show you a simulation of what might be happening in an imaging voxel. So the colored bit on the bottom, the arrows represent magnetization at different locations within this voxel. And what you see is the color map behind it, going from red to yellow, represents the strength of the magnetic field. So we have a gradient on, and it's going from left to right, low to high. And then in the middle there is a plot of the signal. So let's look at what happens then when the magnetization is not moving. Okay, so everything is going to stay still. There's no diffusion. And what happens here is basically what we saw before, but now I'm showing you the spatial distribution of how this dephasing occurs. So things process according to their local field. We flip them. And then they process again according to their local field, and everything comes magically back into alignment. This is precisely the same thing that I was showing you in the previous animation. I'm just showing you now spatially where these different components are within our voxel. So let's now look at the case of diffusion. Oh, and importantly here, we get our signal back. And so here I'm neglecting any signal lost due to T2. We have full recovery of our signal. Okay, if we now look at diffusion, what we see is that we start off with a sort of ordered pattern like we saw before, but it becomes increasingly chaotic. And we flip the magnetization, it continues to diffuse, and at the very end, what we have then is an incomplete return of magnetization into alignment. We no longer have the situation where the first half of the experiment is precisely the same as the second half of the experiment. So we no longer have created this condition whereby however much you've processed in the first half of the experiment, by definition, you're going to undo that motion in the second half. And so we have some residual dephasing, right? These magnetization components, you can see that they're still kind of mostly oriented along the horizontal direction, but nevertheless, they are incoherent relative to each other, and so there's going to be some partial signal cancellation. So that then leads us to how we can use this signal in order to try and quantify diffusion. So here what we have are this is the signal over time. So you're showing that dip representing, again, the midway point of the experiment, and then in the second half you see the signal rebounding to form an echo. And depending on how rapid diffusion is, we have very different behavior. So we have everything from full recovery all the way to signal loss. And so the faster diffusion is, the less signal that we have. And we can quantify how much signal we have depending on the properties of our experiment using what's called the b-value. So a b-value is the tunable parameter that you have in order to determine how strong your signal loss is for a given amount of diffusion, or a given diffusion coefficient. And so basically this is a parameter. You will set it on your scanner. Okay? You will have to make a decision about what this parameter should be when you run a diffusion experiment. And what it determines is the amount of signal loss that you have. So basically the contrast in your image. So the dashed line basically represents the amount of signal that you would have if there was no diffusion at all. Okay? And then the solid line represents the signal that you have when there is diffusion. And so what you can see is the contrast then is the difference between those two things. And that is what drives your ability to estimate that diffusion coefficient. Now, the happy thing that you see here is that this equation, I don't normally like showing equations in talks, but this one is just delightfully simple. That as long as you can get a measurement of what this S0 term is, then you have a relatively simple job ahead of you in terms of being able to estimate this diffusion coefficient, because you know what the b-value is. Again, you're going to set that in your experiment, so it's well defined. So you can think of this b-value as basically your sensitivity to diffusion. So what determines the b-value? Two things, basically. And I've slightly simplified the story here, but broadly, if you think of it in this way, you'll get quite far. Okay, so the b-value is determined primarily by the strength of your gradient. So if you think about what that means, the strength of the gradient is basically for a given displacement, how much is the magnetic field changing? Because that determines how much phase you're going to accumulate, right? If you displace, if a displacement creates a large change in the magnetic field, then all of a sudden your precession rate is going to change quite dramatically. Whereas if you have a shallow gradient, that same displacement doesn't cause much of a difference in your the rate of precession, and so you're not going to accumulate as much phase, and you're not going to dephase as much relative to your neighbors. Similarly, the gradient duration. So how long do we leave these gradients on is going to affect the b-value. And again, that's quite intuitive. So fix the gradient now and think about if I let things diffuse for longer, then they're going to move further in that gradient. And once again, that's going to result then in a larger difference in the rate of precession between the position you started at and the position you ended up at. And so again, you'll accumulate more phase. You'll dephase more relative to your neighbors. Okay, so that's nice. I haven't discussed anything about orientation. So we started off saying that orientation was sort of one of the main effects that we'd be after here. So diffusion orientation then relates to the direction that we apply that gradient pulse along. And so if we think, for example, here I'm showing you spins that have displaced relative to the center point over time. This is anisotropic diffusion, so there is a preferred orientation for those water molecules to displace. And if you think about how our signal loss happens, the further you displace, the more signal loss you have. So if you look along direction 1, you are going to lose more signal because the spins have displaced further. Sorry, if you look along direction 2, things are diffusing further, so you're going to lose more signal. If you look along direction 1, things are not diffusing very far, you're going to have relatively little signal loss. And what this means is when you look at diffusion-weighted images that have been weighted along a given direction, once you kind of know enough, sort of landmarks of anatomy, and you're kind of familiar with this this contrast mechanism, then it's relatively straightforward to just kind of read off what direction the diffusion weighting was along. So here, for example, 3 images with the diffusion gradient along orthogonal directions. So if you look at the first image on the left, you can see that we have most signal loss in the optic radiations. I don't know if I have a pointer here. Well, they've given me a pointer, but I couldn't reach one of these screens if I tried. That's great. Okay, so I'm going to assume you all know where the optic radiations are. If you don't, ask a neighbor. Okay, so if you look in the image on the left, the optic radiations are the bit where we've lost the signal, right? And so that's telling us that that is kind of the direction along which we are applying our diffusion gradients. Conversely, if you look at the corpus callosum, which is attaching the 2 hemispheres, so those tracks run right-left, we see that we have the signal is hyperintense. We've lost almost no signal. And so we know that it's perpendicular to that. Conversely, if you look at the image in the middle, you see the corpus callosum is dark and the optic radiations are bright. And that tells us that that's weighted in the right-left direction. So faster diffusion means less signal. So what we do then in acquiring our images is that we acquire the diffusion weighting along a number of different directions. And in general, the rule of thumb is kind of the more directions you can get, the better. And we'll come to why that is later on. It really has to do with when we move away from sort of simple interpretations of there being a single preferred orientation and we start to look at more complex behavior that might be going on in a voxel. For example, if you have multiple fiber populations, each with their own direction. So we're going to acquire images that are weighted along a number of different directions. We're going to acquire what we call a b equals 0 image. So remember I said we needed a reference for this S0 signal so that we could fully invert the equations that I was showing you. And that's what this b equals 0 is. Basically, an image that has no diffusion weighting applied to it at all. And that then gives us this reference that we need in order to look for the amount of contrast that we have. And if we do that, then we can generate we can use that then to create voxel-wise maps that tell us about something about the diffusion that's going on in that image. And here I'm showing you what's called a fractional anisotropy map. I'm not going to go into what that means. I'm sure other people will. So we basically fit a model of interest, and now all of a sudden we can start to quantify interesting aspects of diffusion. So that's how we achieve diffusion weighting. How do we actually acquire an image? So theoretically, we can do anything we want. So now I'm focusing on, initially I was focusing on the first half of this basic simple pulse sequence where we're looking at those diffusion gradients. Now we're asking the question, what do we do after those diffusion gradients in order to actually acquire an image in this sort of orange box here? And yeah, theoretically we could do anything. There's nothing about this pulse sequence that intrinsically dictates how we would have to go about acquiring that image. But in practice, the single biggest factor that dictates what we do is motion. Although increasingly I kind of think that acquisition speed also kind of leads us to the same answer that motion leads us to. And that is that we have a problem if we try to acquire our images with over multiple excitations. So if we think about what the effect of diffusion is on an image, so our diffusion gradients encode tiny displacements. So these are on the order of tens of microns within the kind of timescales that we look at. So any subject motion, and you can imagine like telling your subjects don't move more than 10 microns. Okay, that's a very difficult thing to ask them to do. And I'll come to it in a moment. It's actually basically impossible unless they're dead. So, so really what the situation that we're in is that if we try to combine data across multiple excitations, we are going to be looking at inconsistent K-space. Okay, and you don't really need to have a very good feeling for what that means. Just know that if you acquire images using multiple excitations and you don't try to remove motion corruption, and there's lots of research on how you can remove that motion corruption, which I don't have time to go into today. But if you don't do anything about it, you'll get an image that looks like this. So that is an axial image. It's actually really difficult to see. It is an axial image in the brain that's fairly low, so you can just see it in a bit of the cerebellum at the bottom of that. So yeah, so you might think, can motion be avoided? And obviously with the sort of spatial scales that we're talking about, of course it can. But even if you could restrain subjects from bulk motion, actually in the brain, there's significant non-rigid pulsatility from the cardiac cycle. So if you think about it, basically every time your heart beats, you have a bunch of blood that rushes into your head. And your skull is a fixed casing, right? It can't accommodate suddenly new volume. So what that means is that when the blood comes in, something has to go out. And amazingly, if you didn't know this, what goes out is your brain. Okay, your brain actually deflects down through the foramen magnum, the big hole at the bottom of your skull. And this motion is kind of what people describe is almost like you're sort of pulling on the person's spine, which is really creepy. But that is actually kind of what it looks like, because the sort of cortex doesn't tend to move too much, but sort of medial structures, the brainstem, they all are actually deflecting a lot throughout your cardiac cycle. And that means that you really can't avoid motion. You just have to accept that it's there. And so usually the way that we deal with this is to essentially freeze motion. And the way that we can do that is by using echoplanar imaging. So I'm assuming most people have probably seen this before, but basically what we're going to do is instead of acquiring our image over multiple shots, we're going to just run through K-space very quickly as we can in a single shot. And what that means is that the motion that we have, although there may be some motion corrupting the signal, it turns out it corrupts the signal in a way that it only corrupts sort of the component of the signal that we're going to throw away anyway, which is the phase of the image. And so it turns out that you can get a perfectly usable image by doing this. So I say perfectly usable. It's an acceptable image, really. If we acquire EPI, what we see is an image that is able to freeze motion, so that's the most important thing that we were going for. But these images have serious distortion, and they tend to have limited resolution. And I'll come back to where that comes from when I get to the sort of limitations and trade-offs. But we can get an image. It's not as beautiful as the one on the left, which was acquired using method other than EPI. But if you look on the right, you can still see similar contrast. And now this is an image where we've been able to freeze motion and avoid those artifacts I was showing earlier. So scan times in diffusion are something that are a very important consideration in terms of your how you go about establishing a protocol. Because in general, we need to consider the total scan time. Usually you'll be in the situation that you know you can keep your subject in the scanner for, let's say, 20 minutes. That's the time that you have. And as a result, there's an interaction between the time that it takes to get each volume and the number of directions that you can get, because those two things multiply together. So each direction of diffusion weighting corresponds to one whole 3D volume. And so however long it takes to get one 3D volume, then to fill out your scan time, that dictates how many directions you can get. And so a really important goal, actually, is trying to keep that TR, the repetition time, which in this case refers to the time it takes to get a whole volume, to keep that TR as short as possible without degrading the quality of the data as a result. So what goes into setting the TR? Well, the TR is basically dictated by the time per slice and the number of slices. So I haven't really gone into slices yet, but this little toy pulse sequence that I've been showing you up until now represents the time that it takes to get a single slice. So when we excite the magnetization, we excite a single slice, a single slab in the brain. That 180-degree pulse is applied to a single slab in the brain. And as a result, because that's the only magnetization that is sort of been created, if you will, then the diffusion gradients only act on that slice, and the EPI only acquires signal from that slice. So when we go to create a 3D volume, then we take that acquisition and we just repeat it from one slice to the next. So we kind of march through the brain, repeatedly doing this experiment of diffusion encoding the signal and then acquiring an image corresponding to that slice. So you can see then that the time that it takes to get one of these volumes is intrinsically tied to how many slices you want. And that's been the situation that we've had for a very long time. And I think people hadn't really necessarily thought about it quite so explicitly and clearly that this was a major limitation that was facing us. But then a few years ago, people started thinking about this problem and realized that actually there is something that we can do to speed this up. And this has been a remarkable step forward over the last few years. And I'm sure some of you in the audience will have access to what's called simultaneous multi-slice imaging. If you don't have access to it now, you will soon. All of the vendors are coming out with this in product in the next couple of years. So the idea here is to say, well, why do we need to go slice by slice through the brain? It turns out that we have actually at our disposal, almost by accident, although of course not exactly by accident, but we have access to a remarkable piece of hardware that enables us to localize signal without using the gradients. So classically, the gradients were able to tell us where the signal was coming from. But here what we have are coils that are distributed throughout the brain. So when the receive coil that you put your subject into, so this is the thing you actually put over their head, classically that was sort of a single coil, and that was where you received your signal from. But now, all of you will probably have heard of people refer to your coils as, oh, you should use the 32-channel coil or using the 20-channel coil, 64-channel coil, okay? What that number means is how many little elements do you have distributed around the subject's head. And because those coils are only sensitive to signal that is close to the coil, each coil imparts some amount of information about where the signal is coming from. So, for example, if we have these slices that are encoded in blue here, let's say, which are slices 3, 6, and 9, you can see that the coils on the top are going to be more sensitive to the slices at the top and less sensitive to the slices at the bottom. And so by sort of thinking about, okay, you know, what's the relative weighting of a signal that I'm acquiring, you can actually sort of tease apart. And even if you excite all of these 3 slices at the same time, the coils have enough information to enable you to separate them out. So if you didn't do anything, you excited all 3 of these slices, diffusion encoded them, and then acquired an EPI image. The image would basically be the summation of these 3. And the trick that we have is, as it turns out, a relatively simple linear formulation that enables you to separate those 3 out post hoc. And so what this does then is it has an enormous ability to reduce the time that it takes to get an imaging volume. As you can see here, if you excite 3 slices simultaneously, you excite them in sets of 3, we can get slice 1, 4, and 7, and then 2, 5, and 8, then 3, 6, and 9, and all of a sudden it takes us a factor of 3 less time in order to get an entire imaging volume. And the beauty of that is that, amazingly, there is almost no SNR penalty associated with that. And I mean, you may not think, wow, but as a physicist, like, that never happens. So it is really quite remarkable. Okay, so at the moment in diffusion imaging, factors of sort of 3 to 4 acceleration are feasible. And that really means that you can think of it, on the one hand, you can think, well, my scan used to take 45 minutes, now it takes 15 minutes. Or you can think, I still have 45 minutes, but I can get 3 times as many diffusion directions. And so there's all sorts of ways that you can kind of play these things against each other. Potentially, you can also try and increase your spatial resolution, although that's a slightly trickier optimization to do. Okay, so what would a typical diffusion experiment look like? And it's always tricky to define what a typical experiment would look like because, well, people just naturally at different centers decide on different protocols. But more importantly, you should not assume that a protocol is fixed. So it's really important to know that there are very good reasons not to go with any of the parameters that I'm showing you here, and you should always think of these as flexible. On the other hand, if you don't have a good reason to go outside of this sort of range of parameters, then I would say you probably should stick with what the field sort of has arrived at as being a good set of parameters. So I didn't have much time to go into echo time. I think I'll return to this a bit later, an important trade-off that we have. But the echo time determines kind of how much signal you have left. So this is an important property to think about, a parameter to think about in your sequence because it dictates your SNR. Unfortunately, there is a trade-off between echo time and b-value. Again, I'll return to that. Spatial resolution. One of the very nice things is that increasingly as I give this talk, every couple of years I realize that my slides are out of date and I need to increase the spatial resolution. We're always pushing to achieve higher and higher spatial resolution. Most of you, 2 millimeters is probably what you can achieve. Those of us who are starting to work at 7 Tesla, maybe we're starting to see the possibility that we might get to 1 millimeter, although there are difficulties, serious difficulties in doing that. And this tends to be tied into distortion and signal-to-noise ratio. And they often dictate at any given time, at the sort of state-of-the-art of the field, what we can actually achieve. Number of directions. I've mentioned this several times as being a really important consideration, depending on what you're trying to do with your data. And I'm sure we'll hear about this more later. The number of directions that you have can really dictate your ability to sort of tease apart subtle differences in the architecture within a given voxel. Finally, b-value, hopefully this one is the clearest to you all. It dictates the sensitivity that we have, and so all things being equal, we'd like b-value to be as high as possible. But because diffusion weighting is fundamentally a signal loss mechanism, so the signal that we have is being driven down by our contrast. It means that you can only drive it down so far before you start to reach the noise floor, okay? And so you need to remain above the noise floor. So there's kind of always a maximum b-value that you can sort of sensibly achieve before all of a sudden you're lost in a sea of noise. Okay, so finally, very quickly, what are the limitations and trade-offs? Okay, I mentioned the fact that EPI images tend to be distorted. I'd like to give you a very quick picture of how I think of that distortion. So I showed this diagram earlier, although you may not have paid much attention to it. This is what the gradients are doing in order to achieve an EPI readout. And it's slightly complicated, but actually I think we can get to understanding why distortion comes about by just simplifying this. And so I like to think of this as the EPI as having a fast and a slow direction, right? So EPI readout, it's bouncing back and forth. Okay, this is where we're kind of rastering from the bottom of K-space to the top. And there's the fast direction, which is the direction that you're bouncing back and forth on. And then there's the slow direction, where you're going slowly from the bottom to the top. And so if we simplify this, we just don't worry about whether the gradients are positive or negative, so flip those. And then let's forget about the fact that they're being turned on and off over time. Let's just actually look at the time average behavior. So what we see is that this fast axis corresponds to an average strong gradient, and the slow axis corresponds to an average low gradient. So that then maps actually nicely onto something that you may or may not be aware of, which is that literally gradients determine how quickly we're moving through K-space. Okay, so let's think about what this looks like in terms of what's happening in the image formation process. So along the fast direction, we have a strong gradient. And that's represented by this expected field. So I'm showing a gradient. The color represents the strength of the magnetic field. I have a relatively strong gradient. Okay, so that color map is varying strongly from left to right. And then in addition, I have some error. So we always have an error in the magnetic field. One of the most common sources of this is air pockets in the head, which create disturbances locally in the magnetic field. And so if we think about then the process of image formation, we think that we have this expected field, and we're going to use that to determine where the signal is coming from. But we have this error on top of it. And so the actual field that we get might look something like this. So when we then try to interpret the frequency of the signal, right, the rate of precession, as telling us where the signal came from, we get some error. And you can see here that the actual field looks mostly like the expected field. It's not too bad of an approximation. So in terms of percent error, the percentage error is relatively small, and as a result, the image formation process largely works. We've pretty much put the signal in the right spatial location. On the other hand, if we look along the slow direction, the phase encode direction, so this is where we're going from bottom to top, this is a low gradient. Okay, so you can see here the range of fields that we have according to this color map is much narrower. And as a result, when we have an error on top of that, the net signal that we get, the net field that we get, the actual field, looks more like this. And so the percent error now is very large. And as a result, when we try to use the frequency that the signal is processing at to tell us where to attribute that signal to, in the spatial domain, we get it wrong. And so you can see then in this image that along that fast direction, along the up-down direction, we have a lot of misplacement of the signal, particularly in the front of the brain where these errors are largest. And so we simply put the signal in the wrong spatial location. Okay, so I'm very quickly going to describe one of the ways that we can deal with that, which is parallel imaging. Again, this is using the coils, so the fact that the coils that we have are distributed spatially. They are most sensitive to the signal that is next to the coils. And so what that enables us to do, in essence, is to cheat a bit on the image formation process. We don't actually have to acquire every single line. And by being able to skip, for example, every other line, or only acquire every third line, what we do, in essence, is we move through K-space more quickly. Okay? So our slow gradient is going to be a bit stronger. And as a result, the percent error that we have on the bottom as compared to the top along this slow direction is less. So parallel imaging then enables you to reduce the distortion in your images. And here I'm just showing you an example of the difference between with and without parallel imaging. I'm doing a trick that we have for assessing distortions, which is to acquire two images, one from bottom to top and one from top to bottom. It turns out that essentially causes the distortions to go in the opposite direction. And this then gives you a feeling for the amount to which you can reduce the distortions. It also gives you a feeling for the fact that the distortions are not only in the frontal cortex, although that's kind of where they're at their most charismatic. You can see actually in the temporal lobes quite a lot of distortion in your images. And this is a really useful way to look at your data in order to determine how bad your distortions are, because you might not realize just how distorted the entire image actually is. Okay, I'm not going to go through that. I'm just going to finish by telling you about another important trade-off that you have in a diffusion imaging experiment, which is B-value versus echo time. And so I hinted at this earlier. So here we're looking at the signal decay that we have compared to the echo time. And so we're losing signal due to T2 decay. Okay, so this is not now signal loss due to the diffusion process. This is due to relaxation time. And unfortunately, the situation that we're in is that in a clinical system where we have limited gradient strength, so that the G value here is limited, if we want to increase our B value, the only way that we can do that is to increase the duration of the diffusion gradients. Okay? So this then leads to a trade-off. If we want to increase our B value, then by definition, we have to increase that echo time and we lose more signal. So if we just accept, okay, I need to get a B value of, let's say, 3,000, and that has dictated how long that preparation has to be, then the situation becomes, how can I make my my acquisition, my readout itself, as brief as possible and reduce this echo time. And we always define echo time with respect to the center of k-space, and there are good reasons for that I don't have time to go into. So one way that we can do that, and this is a very commonly employed trick in diffusion imaging, is we have our EPI readout, and I've tipped it on its side on the bottom there. One thing we can do is actually throw away, not even acquire, a fraction of the lines at the beginning of the readout. It turns out that we don't necessarily need those lines. We can use clever reconstructions to recover them. And that then pushes this center of k-space, where we have the hotspot of the signal, into a shorter period of time. Another possibility is we could use parallel imaging that I referred to earlier. So I talked about that as a way of reducing distortion. It can also reduce the echo time, and although in effect this is a much more subtle balance because there are more SNR implications associated with that. Okay, so with that, I'm not going to actually talk about eddy currents. I am just going to end by saying, I've really only covered common methods today because I think that's kind of the most useful thing. It's probably everything that follows is mostly going to assume that the acquisitions that I've described are the acquisitions that you would be using. There are alternatives both to the spin echo aspects of the sequence that I talked about, as well as the EPI aspects of it. And sometimes there are good reasons to use those, but to be honest, in the absence, again, of a good reason for doing it, spin echo EPI will mostly get you there. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Carla. I think we have time for one or two quick questions, and then if anyone wants to say.
Got one over here.
Yep.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could comment briefly on what you think about either monopolar or bipolar, and possibly provide a quick explanation of that.
Sure. Yes. Okay. So this is one of the ways that we can deviate from what I've shown you. So what I showed you in terms of the diffusion weighting component of the sequence were just these two simple gradients that we add between our RF pulses, so between excitation of 180 and 180 and the acquisition. And that's sort of the canonical classical way of doing this. And oh my God, I'm actually going to try and go back. Okay, we'll see how this goes. And this actually relates to eddy currents. So when you have that kind of an acquisition, it turns out that when you try and turn these gradients on, you can't immediately switch them on. There's basic physics that says that it takes some time for that field to ramp up. There's also some time that it takes for the field to ramp down. And what happens is that field ramping down can creep into your EPI acquisition. So in other words, you still have some effect of those diffusion gradients that is slowly dying out over your acquisition. And that wouldn't necessarily be a very big problem if it wasn't for the fact that the direction of those diffusion gradients is varying from acquisition to acquisition. And so that then creates these kind of effects where you have distortions and shearings of the image over different directions. So here we're just running through different diffusion directions, and that's not motion, that is artifacts. So the bipolar scheme that you were mentioning aims to specifically address this. And the way that it does it is it just tries to cause these eddy currents to cancel from one gradient to the next. And it's kind of very clever how that works, but it's not particularly important. There's basically two things we can do. If we want to address these eddy currents and minimize them, because if we don't deal with them, we'll get images like that on the right. This is a fractional anisotropy image. You see these bright bits around the edge. That's not high fractional anisotropy, that's just motion or eddy currents. So we can either try and remove this in acquisition, which costs us in terms of echo time. That's the solution that the field had kind of been at up until the last maybe 5 years. Everybody sort of thought the best to avoid it in acquisition. Increasingly, there are sophisticated ways of dealing with this in post-processing, which really are able to do a remarkably good job. And so increasingly, I think people are going back to the original monopolar scheme where we just have those two gradients. So what I would say is, unless you have a very good way of dealing with these effects, you probably want to use a bipolar scheme. But if you want to look into ways of correcting them in post-processing, you can reap the benefits in terms of having a bit of a boost in signal-to-noise level as a result.
So your opinion at this point is that post-processing is probably the better way to go?
I would say so. I mean, so this is a really good example where, you know, some very careful piloting will get you a long way. So, you know, in your scanner, you know, with your, you know, preferred pulse sequence, try some of these methods that are available. I mean, so being in Oxford, you know, the FSL software package has a version, you know, that's able to deal with this. I'm sure lots of other software packages have some, whatever software package you are expert in, look into what eddy current correction they have, pilot it and see if it does better in terms of these artifacts and SNR than the monopolar, sorry, the bipolar. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.